I was just watching a video by Veritasium about voting and the problems of voting. And apparently there was this guy, Arrow, who showed that if you really wanted fair voting, in the sense that a reasonable, most of us would say is fair, it's actually impossible to fulfill all 5 of those parameters simultaneously. And what that means is that there is no real fair democratic voting system, no matter how you try to put it together, cobble it together. It will always be unfair. Meaning that one of those parameters, one of the 5 parameters, will get violated. So I'm not going to get too much into that because he already covered it, but I found something that might be, I was thinking, okay, what's the solution here? Because we still have to make choices. So then do we get rid of democracy altogether, or like what's the solution? So I thought he used a very simple illustration, which I think is good to try to make things as parsimonious as possible so that you don't have any loose ends and get lost in the details. Make it really simple. And he used burgers, pizza, and sushi, and trying to figure out what you're going to eat for dinner. And you've got 3 people, 3 friends trying to figure out what they're all going to eat for dinner. And if they have preferences, let's say one of them prefers burgers to pizza and then prefers pizza to sushi, well, that means that they prefer burgers to sushi. And it's sort of like the wasps who figure out if they are going to lose or win a battle against another wasp. Well, they'll figure that out based off of who their opponent has won or lost against, and they form these hierarchies based off of past wins and losses, which I have found fascinating. That's something I keep in mind a lot. And it was an idea that I threw around in my head for a little bit. But the problem with it is that you can get into this paradox where you have burgers as preferred to pizza, pizza as preferred to sushi, but then somehow sushi as preferred to burgers. And it loops onto itself, and that becomes irresolvable. And there's all these paradoxes that happen when you try to rank your preferences across 3 or more candidates or choices or people. So being that I like having 3 choices all the time, and being that it's been mathematically proven, and I take math very seriously, that democracy can't really be fair in the traditional sense, the solution that I thought might help is, instead of voting for candidates or voting for a specific thing, what if we vote for values which we're hopefully using to determine our preference for these candidates? Not only that, but it also cuts out low information voters or people who don't have enough time or energy to get that information, or are irascible or excitable or emotionally swayed, and they won't be imbalancing the elections. So let's go back to that pizza burger sushi dilemma. Only this time we'll use the pizza, the burger, and the sushi will still be there, but they won't be what we vote on. Instead, we'll vote on our values that underpin why we prefer pizza over sushi or burgers over pizza. And we'll use 3 metrics of price, health, and what was the third one? Oh, flavor, right. Price, health, and flavor, rather than burgers, pizza, and sushi. Well, price, we'll say, favors pizza. Pizza's cheap. And we'll say flavor is more in the burger. very flavorful burgers. And this isn't something that I'm going to try to rigorously prove that pizzas have more are cheaper than burgers, or that burgers are more flavorful than pizza. We'll just take that as given, and then sushi will be the healthiest choice. If we then, instead of voting on sushi and burgers and pizzas, instead vote on values, which those things would have more or less of, what we could do is we could say that one of those three things is the cheapest, one of those three things is the healthiest, and one of those three things is the most flavorful, independently of each other. And they're always going to have a closest match. There's not going to ever be a time in which you'll find every single one of those things has the same price, or they're all equally interchangeably healthy or unhealthy, or they're all equally interchangeably flavorful or bland. There will always be a closest, as long as the value that we're using can be operationally defined. If it's something that can be empirically verified, then we can use it as an ideal, and we can then use a measure between that ideal and the candidates or the changes that we're voting on. And we can operationally define those changes or candidates' policies so that we can determine objectively which of those candidates or changes is objectively closest to our values. And the only thing that we then have to subject to voting is which value is the most valuable, which is exactly what we're really doing when we vote. We're saying, I value such and such. What we instead, unfortunately, err in when we vote is in our identification of which candidate. For example, we don't even have policies, which I don't understand how that's even possible, but we don't have any policy accountability at all in any government on this planet anywhere. So if instead of voting for a candidate, we vote for policies, and if those policies are written in such a way that they're full, they're complete, so there's no gaps, and they're not able to contradict themselves, so one position that they might hold over here can't automatically violate their position over there, so they have one integrated system. And finally, that policy can't violate the federal or state law that it's being applied within. And the only way that we could ever do that is if we had an operationally defined constitution and operationally defined terms in that constitution, like operationally defining what harm is. Harm is a subjective term currently on this planet, but it could easily be operationally defined as anything that breaks the skin, or anything that breaks blood vessels, causes bruising, bloodletting in some way. Either blood gets spilled outside the body or blood gets spilled outside the blood vessel. Something like that would then determine what harm is, physical harm. And then emotional harm and all that stuff, we won't be able to determine that because that's subjective. And that's what I'm getting at as far as what's wrong with our voting system. It's not necessarily just that you have all these problems with fairness in democracy, as Veritasium's channel was showing or proving. That's a problem, sure, but deeper than that even is the problem of identification between the voter's ideal, which is really what's determining what their vote is. It's the weight by which they say one candidate is worth more than another. Worth more in regards to what? Worth more in regards to the voter's ideals or values. And those values are ultimately the only determinant that they're using. Everything else is a derivative of that value that they hold. So when a voter gets presented with Bush versus Gore, they might vote for Gore if they're more left-leaning or democratically leaning, if they care more about liberal values. And what are those values in contrast to the Republican values? Well, the liberal values would be geared more towards, I don't know, equality of opportunity or something like that. And the conservative view might be more opportunity for the best people. So the question then is a question between, do we value every person's opportunity equally, knowing that some of them are going to waste that because they just don't have the motivation or resources to capitalize on their own potential? Or do we advocate for an imbalance in opportunity and thus cut someone off at the knees where they might have been able to succeed, and we don't know whether or not they're going to succeed, but we estimate that they probably won't or probably will, depending on their past performance, let's say. And thus we capitalize on the best people and give them the greatest amount of opportunity. And by doing so, we sacrifice the least scoring people on some metric, showing that they probably won't ever materialize their opportunities, no matter what opportunities that they're given. And so the value then becomes, are we talking about, do we value, and this is purely subjective, there's not really any way of determining which one of those is objectively better than the other one, because what we're talking about is the difference not of outcome, but of the justice of determining whether or not someone gets a chance in the first place. And we say, well, in the past, this person has abused drugs, or in the past, they've been in jail, in the past that they've done this, but the past is not the future. So we don't know if that person is actually going to, in the future, turn over a new leaf and then, change their life and begin to actualize on their own potential or not. Now, we can statistically, over a long period of time, across lots of people, overall, on average, statistically say, yeah, we can, follow trends, and we can say that some people are more deserving of that opportunity over others. But yet, we can't determine specifically, individually, which of those individuals will actually manifest their possibilities and take advantage of those opportunities, or just waste them. So we can talk about statistical probabilities, or we can talk about individual subjective choice. And which of those two is greater than the other? Well, that's comparing apples to oranges. So rather than trying to vote on candidates, rather than trying to vote on policies, and even rather than trying to vote on specific issues, what we should do is we should vote on values. And then the rest of those, given the system being streamlined enough that it can operationally define everything in it, we can then objectively determine which of those candidates, policies, or changes, proposed bills for change, are most in line with our values. The only thing that we can't objectively determine is which of those values is better than the others, because they're not objective values, they're subjective values. So that's the only thing that we really should be voting on, is values. And that should just be left up to the voters as to which values that they want proposed or left out of the ballot, and then they just vote on those values. And even the values have to be operationally defined, because we have to objectively identify which of the candidates or proposed bill changes most closely matches with those ideals. and which one of those is objectively closest to those ideals. And so those ideals have to be operationally defined. So, like price can be operationally defined. That's just how much something costs in units of dollars, for example. Whatever the currency is that you're going to use to buy something. So that's really easy. Health is a little bit different. How do you operationally define what is healthy versus what is unhealthy? Well, you could do, you could say what statistically on average has proven to be effective at reducing heart risk or digestive problems or something like that. What do most healthy people eat? What do most people who score the lowest on, all these risk factors for their health eat? And then we can determine what is healthy versus what is unhealthy, just objectively from science. And the same thing for flavor. If we operationally define what is more or less flavorful, then that's, with flavor being subjective, you would have to reduce that to some kind of a nominal vote. And so then that wouldn't really be, it wouldn't completely operationally define it, but it would at least make it objective by expanding beyond the individual that has the subjective experience and then averaging or creating an aggregate of a large sample base of all the people that voted that one thing was more flavorful than another thing. Or you could even possibly reduce things down to what is a flavonoid, or what is the molecular compound that makes something chemically more or less flavorful. And then if you have isolated what that chemical is, then you can just scientifically determine or ascertain how much of that chemical is in whatever the food is. And so there are ways of making these determinations more objectively than we do currently. And I think that's really the crux of the voting problems that we will always have, is how do we identify what changes would be best in society is based on how closely those changes align or not with our values. And of course, given that we're all trying to come to an agreement with each other, we have to pick objectivism as the field within which we measure that, because that's the only field that we can all agree on. And it's the only field that has that can be reducible to a single answer. Relativity is something that we could all agree on too, but that's where you run into those paradoxes where burgers are preferred to pizza and pizza is preferred to sushi, but somehow sushi is also preferred to burgers. So that can happen in relativity, where your voting system is not objective yet. It's just relative, based off of, do you prefer this more or less than that? That's relativistic. It's not assigning an actual number to it. It's just assigning a relativistic greater than or less than relation between those things. And so the answer is then relative. It isn't objective. And that's why you have room enough in there for paradoxes like that. And the main problem that was brought up in there is, well, if you have all these parties, they will eventually resolve back to two, where you only have the choice between two parties, which means that roughly 50% of the population is always dissatisfied, is how I took it. That's what I read out of it. Given any voting system, you're going to eventually reduce everything down to two parties, because if you throw Ralph Nader into the mix, he's not going to get elected. He just doesn't have enough popularity in order to win against the other two primary candidates. So the only thing that he can do is affect the primary candidates, and everything always eventually goes back to those two and only two primary candidates, either this or that, and that's it. And that happens because people are voting for candidates instead of voting for their values. If they vote for their values, then we don't have to worry about somebody breaking past a certain threshold, like 50% or whatever it is, where they attain majority. They don't have to attain majority anymore. They don't have to be above 50% of the population. The only thing that they have to do is have a policy which closely associates with a particular value. And then if that value to which their policy is measured the closest in alignment with, if that value ends up being the most popular value, then their policy will be the most popular policy, and then that candidate will be the most popular candidate. And then we don't have to worry about the 50% problem, where you have so many people that are dissatisfied and only one party that is satisfied. And that's what I've always found inherently almost deceitful about democracies, is that you don't really have what it presents itself to be. It presents itself as if all of the voters have power, but they don't. The power that they have is isolated to two candidates, and they can either vote for one of them or they can vote for the other one. But anyone else that they vote for, it's irrelevant. It just ends up being an indirect vote for the final two. And these problems happen because we're focusing on the popularity of the candidate, not what their policy is and not what our values are. And we skip over both of those things and jump right to the candidate. If instead we voted for our ideals or our values, and let's say that you only have one value that you can prioritize above all the other ones, then you're going to have a policy which is closest objectively. If you operationally define that value and you operationally define the candidate's policy, then you can objectively determine which of those policies is the closest matching to that ideal. So let's say, for example, if we go back to pizzas, burgers, and sushi, and using the values of price, health, and flavor, and we've already discussed how that can be operationally defined. And let's say that pizza costs $5, and we'll just keep the calories as the same across so that it's fair, so that we're comparing apples to apples. So we've got a pizza slice which has 100 calories, let's say, or something like that. I don't know, maybe it's 300 calories. I don't know how many calories are in a slice of pizza, but let's just say that it's the same caloric intake for each of the food items to make it fair. Pizza costs $5, sushi costs $10, and burgers cost $7.50, halfway in between. There will, or even let's say they all cost exactly the same. Let's say that all three of them cost $5, and then how do you determine which of them is the best? Well, then you've got the other two values that will break it. If you add enough of those values onto them, and this is what happens, for example, in the military when there's two candidates that match identically or score identically for the position that they're trying to get. Let's say that there's three candidates and there's only one open position, and all three of them want that position, and they all score identically on their major markers. They get the same score on their tests. They get the same marks for they all have the same rank, they all have the same scores, they all have the same major prerequisites. Well, then what do? They look at other stuff that's tangential to that. They look to see, well, did any of these candidates get into legal trouble? Did any of these candidates excel in something that the other two didn't? Like, did they qualify for a pistol qualification? It doesn't even have anything to do with the position, but do they just have something of an advantage, even if it's irrelevant, over the other two candidates? And then that's how they eventually make their choice. There are no two identical candidates. There are no two identical anythings. You can't have two identical things. If they share all their properties, then they're one thing, according to Leibniz's law of indiscernibles. And that's what I'm getting at, is if there is anything that's distinct between two or more things that we're voting on, then we can use that margin of difference between those two or more things. We can operationally define what that difference is, and then we can discern which of those is closer or further away. And they cannot be equidistant. There will always be a breaking point where one of them is closer and the other one is further away. Now, a simplified version of that would be you have simple majority popularity where you don't have to have a 50% threshold of agreement in the population of voters to elect some person or some change. Where instead of it being 50% of the population has to agree, then you only have to have most of the votes going towards someone. But the problem with that is that it leaves most voters dissatisfied. And that's why it's not really a democracy. And so then, like I said, the best decision is to vote for the ideals and the values rather than the candidates directly. Because if you vote for the candidates directly, then you're going to dissatisfy the voters. But the voters can't be dissatisfied if everything is objectively determined. And the only thing that they can say is, I really wish that my value were more popular. Well, that's what you can campaign for. You can use political activism for. And then it becomes similar to religions, where it's like you've got, instead of missionaries, you would have political activists that would get on the stage or something like that, or say, hey, you on the street, listen to me for a few minutes, take this brochure, go to this place, whatever it is, and try to recruit people to say, this is why this value is so much more valuable than some other value. But then you realize that what you're doing is you're engaging in art, and you're engaging in a subjective, purely subjective art form of determining which ideal is the most ideal, rather than claiming that one of the candidates is better or worse than another candidate or policy change or something like that. The reason that people get dissatisfied in those situations is because they're picking up on something objective about the policy change or the candidate that they personally just can't tolerate, and then they're confusing that with the rigor of the voting system. Because like I say, we skip over that step where we're identifying the candidate to our ideals, because that's what we do when we vote anyway. But the problem that happens that ends up dissatisfying the voter is that the voter never has enough time or energy or expertise to be able to correctly identify which of those candidates actually does closely fit their ideal. They'll go back on their word, they'll present themselves as one thing and then turn around and be a turncoat the next. They'll represent a party that the voter finds intolerable, but yet their policy is perfectly sound. But they happen to represent the party that the voter can't stand. And these mistakes and errors get conflated together until it's so arbitrary and so random that basically at the end of all democratic systems that we currently have on the earth, the only thing that we're really doing is putting names in a hat and then drawing them out randomly. Because there's so much noise and so much error that goes into the voting that we don't really do what we think that we're doing. We don't actually vote for these people or policy changes. We are trying to figure out what our ideals would look like if they were manifested into the world without having access to any data and without having any objective measure by which we could determine that. So we invariably end up going back to some heuristic or some other logical fallacy, some completely empirically unverifiable feeling that we think is a fact, but isn't actually a fact. And then we end up voting for someone that doesn't have anything to do with our ideal. And then we have dissatisfaction. So I think that the solution is first and foremost to operationally define all this stuff in the system. Make the candidate must have an operationally defined policy that they cannot go back on after elected. And really, ideally, we need to be voting for policies, not candidates. The candidate should only be there to try to discern or determine what would be most in line with that policy. And they should represent that policy, not people, because people change their minds. People are subjects. People can't be operationally defined. We don't know what a people is. Scientifically speaking, there is no definition because it's a subject. It's a subjective thing. It's a subjective idea. You can't really objectify a subject and turn them into a point of data. It just can't happen. So candidates should not represent voters. Candidates should represent policies. Voters should represent values, and policies and values should both be operationally defined so that they can be matched together objectively. When all of that is the case, then there won't be any room for voter dissatisfaction because everything that they do will actualize in the way that they're trying to actualize it, instead of it being a bunch of errors and randomness and betrayal and craziness. It's very streamlined, it's very simple, and it's scientifically accurate and reliable and robust and transparent. And it's really easy to discern fairness and equality.